giúp cho các những người trong cộng đồng có thể
Again, thank you very much for joining the pre-forum webinar on the resilience of communities led by the United Nations Development Program.
UNDP
Webinar is titled Accelerating Locally-Led Adaptation to Enhance Community Resilience. We would like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded, and also this webinar is interpretation-enabled with English and Vietnamese languages. Please check your controls for the interpretation button. Questions, please use the Q&A chat box, and we will be checking and moderating your questions and insights. And to formally start our session and provide an introduction to the APAN pre-forum webinar, may I call on Mr. Mozaharul Alam, the Regional Climate Action Coordinator and Head of the Pacific Adaptation Network of the United Nations Environment Program, Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Babu, please, the virtual floor is yours.
Ngài Babu, xin mời.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa.
Cảm ơn chị Vanessa.
On behalf of Asia Pacific
Thay mặt
Adaptation Network
cho
Secretariat,
chương trình mạng lưới thích ứng của khu vực châu Á Thái Bình Dương, chúng tôi xin chào mừng tất cả quý vị từ các
dear participants, the climate crisis is here, and we all know. And the impacts of climate change are devastating our communities.
Các bạn đã biết là hiện nay thì biến đổi khí hậu đang làm cho chúng ta có ảnh hưởng rất nhiều trong cuộc sống và sinh kế. Và do vậy mà tất cả các cái cộng đều cần phải có những cái biện pháp để thích ứng trong cái khả năng sinh kế của mình. Nhiệt độ toàn cầu ngày càng
so this gives the sense of the change happened already, and then what we are expecting in future. So the crisis is here. So I'd like to welcome you also in this the webinar, the session on accelerating locally led adaptation to enhance the community resilience, as you have already heard, organized by the United Nations Development Program. So please accept my deep appreciation and gratitude for all of you for joining the pre-webinar session. This pre-webinar, the pre-forum webinar is the third one in the series of the four, which we are focusing on the four resilience themes. That is the resilience of communities, resilience of food systems, the resilience of cities, infrastructure and settlement, and the resilience of the ecosystem and the ecosystem services. The pre-forum webinar on the resilience of ecosystem and the ecosystem services is going to be the fourth one, and we'll be delivering it today. So I welcome you also to join.
Mà tôi mong muốn các bạn cùng tham gia vào cái phần phiên trình bày của bốn diễn giả trong phiên họp chiều hôm nay.
Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum.
Như chúng ta thấy cái diễn đàn về thích ứng này đều là các cái diễn đàn được trong đó có các đại biểu trao đổi
across the Asia Pacific region. And the outcome of the pre-forum webinars will feed into the overall program of the main forum. So your input in the pre-forum webinar is going to be very, very important for us, and also to further foster a mutual understanding of the recommendation for accelerating the transformation towards the climate resilience. As many of you know, this the Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum is considered as the Asia Pacific largest and the long-standing gathering of adaptation practitioners to share information, knowledge, and best practices in adaptation and the resilience building. And I'm happy to see Selim, who is basically involved in APAN since its inception in 2009. The 8th Asia Pacific, the Climate Change Adaptation Forum will take place from 30th of August to 1st of September in Incheon City in the Republic of Korea. And this year, the theme of the forum is resilience for all and enabling the transformative implementation. And I'd like to emphasize on the word transformative implementation, because we need to embark on shifting and the scaling up our adaptation action, as the current actions are very, very inadequate. So before I end, it is my honor also to introduce one of my esteemed colleagues, Akiko, from the UNDP, also to deliver the opening messages. And then let me briefly mention about Akiko. And she is the regional team leader for the Asia and the Pacific region, the nature and the climate and the energy team in the Bureau for Policy and the Program Support and the policy network. She is responsible for guiding and leading the provision of integrated policy and the program advisory services to country offices in multidisciplinary technical areas, including the natural capital, climate change, energy, chemicals and the waste, water and ocean, the forest conservation, NDCs as well. She has been working on environmental management issues in the context of development for more than 25 years. So ladies and gentlemen, let's just welcome Akiko to deliver the welcome message. Over to you, Akiko, and nice to see you.
Thank you very much, Babu, for the introduction to this APAN pre-event webinar, and also walking us through the process on how today's discussion will feed into the 8th APAN Forum discussions later this month in Korea and beyond. I would like to warmly welcome all of you participants to the APAN pre-event webinar titled Accelerating Locally Led Adaptation to Enhance Community Resilience. As mentioned by Babu, this event officially kickstarts dialogues among APAN communities on the resilience of communities stream for the 8th APAN Forum. We, UNDP, are very pleased and honored to be able to lead this stream focused on the communities once again this year, as we did during the 7th APAN Forum in 2021. As the stream lead, we have prepared a draft resilience outlook on resilience of communities. I trust that the draft document was shared with you all for your review and comment, but we will use this webinar as an opportunity to present the draft, seek for your inputs and reactions, and incorporate your inputs before the document is finalized. This resilience outlook builds upon the previous one titled Communities and Local Resilience Outlook, prepared for the 7th APAN discussions in 2021. Both outlooks are driven by the principles for locally led adaptation, which UNDP family subscribes to. And allow me to give a little update on this. The principles for locally led adaptation was highlighted in the Communities and Locally Resilient Outlook in 2021, and it has been endorsed in January 2021 during the 7th APAN Forum by more than 40 organizations, including UNDP. In the past 2 years, the number of organizations that subscribe to these principles has grown to over 100 organizations in Asia and the Pacific, and led to the growing momentum in adaptation and implementation on the ground. As all of us are making progress in implementing the principles, we want to take stock of this progress. To do this, we have brought together a group of experts and practitioners in this webinar so that they can share their thoughts and reflections on progress and any struggles and challenges that they encounter. We are very much looking forward to substantive and fruitful discussions from this panel of experts, as well as from the participants online on their views of the implementation of the principles on the ground, and how we can move forward with the challenges we are facing, and how we can enhance the impact of these principles. In closing, I would like to thank UNEP as the APAN Secretariat, the Government of Korea as the host organization, host government for the 8th APAN Forum, and colleagues from Adaptation Fund, ICCCD, and participants from all over the regions.
Alo, thì có nghe được tiếng Anh nói không nhỉ?
Engaging with us
Nghe được hiểu cũng
dialogue today.
em
Rồi.
nói nhập em cũng không
And
hiểu.
also our own colleagues
Ok,
from
ok.
UNDP
Rồi.
for organizing.
Vậy là vừa rồi thì về mặt kỹ
Thank you very much.
Dạ.
Thank you, Akiko. My name is Krib Siddhatani. I'm the
Tên tôi là
Regional Coordinator for Asia Pacific for the Climate
hiện đang
Policy and
làm việc
Scale
tại Trung
Initiative.
tâm biến đổi khí hậu và phát
From
triển
UNDP.
ICCD.
I'll be your moderator for this
Tôi
webinar.
có mặt tại đây trong
Next
cái
up
hội
is
này
our keynote
để
speaker,
phần
Professor
tiếp
Salimo
theo
Haq.
là xin
He is the director of the
mời
International Center for Climate Change and
thi
Development,
ở
ICCCAD,
khu vực
and professor at the
Việt Nam.
Independent University of University Bangladesh, as well as associate of the International Institute on Environment and Development in the United Kingdom. In addition, he is the chair of the expert advisory group for the Climate Change Vulnerable Forum, and also senior advisor on locally led adaptation with Global Center on Adaptation, headquartered in the Netherlands. Here, Professor Salimo Haq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Krib. Good morning to everybody from Dhaka, Bangladesh. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you, and apologies for not having any prepared slides. I'll just speak for the 10 minutes allotted to me, and I'll do it on 3 themes related to the topic of this webinar. The first theme is discussing a little bit on the status of the science of adaptation to climate change. The second is on the practice of adaptation to climate change. And the third is looking forward into the future of where we need to go and how we might be able to do that. So starting with the science of adaptation is a very young science. It's maybe just 10 or 12 or at most 15 years old. It has been in practice, and it's a learning by doing science. We are learning adaptation by doing adaptation, not learning adaptation by theory. It's not a theory-based science, it's a practice-based science. And the more we do, the more we learn. And over the last decade or so, we have done a lot and we have learned a lot. So I'll share some lessons that we have learned already. The first lesson is that adaptation to climate change is not just simply development. It's an additional layer to development that involves knowledge of pending climate, in coming forward in the future and preparing for it and being able to deal with it in advance. So knowledge is a key component, knowledge of upcoming climatic changes, both in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, and being better prepared to deal with them on those different timescales, immediate timescales, medium-term timescales, and long-term timescales. And increasingly, we are learning how to do this all over the world because climate change is happening all over the world, and communities everywhere are having to prepare themselves with adaptation. This means that vulnerable communities everywhere in all countries around the world are the ones who need it most, who are the ones that need to be empowered, enabled with knowledge to deal with the impacts of climate change and prepare themselves accordingly. And within this, we have found that the locally led adaptation part of adaptation, which is more of a bottom-up approach, is a very, very effective, in fact, a much more effective way of creating adaptive capacity of societies than a top-down approach, which has been applied in many, many cases. In fact, one of the findings of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC was that many top-down projects on adaptation failed to succeed in their objectives, and even some of them not only failed, but they made things worse. And the main reason was that these were prepared and implemented by external so-called experts, both international and national, and they didn't listen to the local people who actually knew what the situation was, and in many cases knew much better than these external experts what needed to be done. So within the adaptation arena, as you've just heard from Akiko, the community of practice, the community of researchers have developed the 8 principles. It's now being adopted by many organizations, countries, and people, and increasingly being practiced. And in fact, my center runs an annual conference called Gobeshona, where we bring together practitioners and researchers over 7 days. We run it for 24 hours a day, over 7 days, a purely online conference. If anybody's interested, I'll put the link in the chat room, and you can, or look it up, just look up Gobeshona and you can find it. The next conference will be in April of 2024. If you want to run a session, you'd be most welcome. So the science of adaptation is moving very fast. The science of locally led adaptation is also moving fast. More and more practice to theory, knowledge sharing is taking place. And one of the main lessons we have found is the most effective way of sharing lessons is peer-to-peer exchange of knowledge. And in Bangladesh, where I am located, we very often get peer groups coming to visit us from neighboring countries, even from far away from Africa. They come to see what Bangladesh is doing because Bangladesh is quite well advanced on locally led adaptation. Let me move on now to the second aspect of practice of adaptation. As I just mentioned, in the global arena, you will know that the international negotiations under the Kyoto Protocol, the developed countries pledged to provide $100 billion a year to the developing countries to support mitigation and adaptation. Unfortunately, they spent 80% of the funds that they did give, and they didn't even give the 100 billion. It was always short of the 100 billion. But the majority of it went to mitigation and the minority to adaptation. They have recognized this lacuna, and they have promised to double the funding for adaptation from 20% to 40%. They are on the way to do that. They have not achieved it yet, but they are on the way to do that. And as a result, many hundreds of projects on adaptation have been implemented. And as I said, lessons are being learned from that. But the problem with adaptation is that it's very location specific. Every place is different from another place. And so lesson learning from one does not mean just simply applying the same tool everywhere. It means understanding the context and then being able to share how to deal with the problem, how to solve the problem, how to manage the problem. And it involves a lot of people-to-people skills, not just technical skills. It's not building something, building a well or planting trees. It's not as simple as that. It's much more complex, and it requires people understanding what to do. And that's where locally led adaptation is a very important element, without which you cannot have successful adaptation, in my view. The local people, who are the ones who suffer the impacts of climate change, are the ones that need to know what to do. And in fact, in many cases, they actually know much better than external experts or national experts what needs to be done. And then they need to be supported in doing what they do. Obviously, they cannot do everything. They are very localized, but they can provide inputs into planning. So the locally led adaptation principles require that we listen to the people first and then decide what it is to be done together with them. They must be part of the planning. They must be part of the decision making. They must be part of the implementation. And indeed, they must be part of the monitoring and evaluation, because that really is where it makes a difference. Are we monitoring and evaluating for donors, or are we monitoring and evaluating for the local communities who are suffering the impacts of climate change? At the moment, I would say almost 90% or more evaluation is done for the donors and not for the local people. So that's an area that we need to do. Finally, let me just say a few words about the future. And as Babu has mentioned, we need to be transforming ourselves. We are not moving fast enough. In fact, as Secretary General Guterres has mentioned, we have already entered the era of climate boiling, as the frogs in the pan are boiling. You know, the proverbial frogs, that the heat goes up so slowly that the frogs don't realize that they're boiling, and then they die. human beings are not frogs. We can realize, and we are realizing, that it's gone to the temperature has become intolerable. We now need to take action at a crisis and emergency level, and adaptation and locally led adaptation has to become central to that to prevent the impacts causing losses and damages. So in fact, nowadays, I call adaptation to climate change no longer preparing for future climate change, but actually preparing to minimize the losses and damages that will inevitably happen to the impacts of climate change. And in fact, a lot of the research work my center now does looks at locally led adaptation and locally led dealing with loss and damage as the impacts begin to happen, and they are happening everywhere as well. So LLA and LLD is now a one nexus approach. We do adaptation until climate happens, and then when climate change happens, we have to deal with the consequences in terms of losses and damages. But good adaptation will make sure that we minimize the losses and damages, whereas bad adaptation or lack of adaptation will mean that we'll maximize the losses and damages, which we want to avoid. So I look forward to seeing many of you in Korea at the APAN conference coming up. I plan to be there for the full period and hope to be able to see many of you at that time. For now, I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Professor Salimo. So I really like your point about how now you're seeing, the locally led adaptation as one with the loss and damage, and how to really, looking at it from a framing of minimizing impacts of the impending loss and damage due to the climate crisis that we're experiencing, and also that there are positive sign that the funding is moving forward and heading more towards the right direction from developed countries, specifically on their $100 billion pledge to
có những cái khoản mà
40%.
chúng ta cần đến khoảng
And next is we as the stream lead will present our draft summary of our draft outlook. Please allow me to introduce Mr. Kama Lode Rapton, our regional technical specialist from UNDP. He's our leading climate adaptation expert with extensive experience in developing projects and also overseeing implementation of adaptation projects across the region. And over to you, Karma. Thank you.
Thanks, Krib. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Krib. This outlook was prepared, based on our experience as well as, in consultation with colleagues across our adaptation portfolio. And it's being circulated now as a draft, and then we will, as Krib mentioned, really appreciate your inputs, suggestions before we finalize the outlook. Can we go to the slides, please? Next slide. Yeah, next one. Yeah, so in terms of the current status in the Asia Pacific region, over the past 50 odd years, the Asia Pacific region has suffered immensely, with an estimated 1 million lives lost and a staggering 1.2 trillion in economic losses due to extreme climate events. When you compare disasters as a percentage of GDP, Asia Pacific ranks the highest among all regions in the world. Also, the devastating floods that struck Pakistan in 2022 serves as a grim reminder of the urgent need for global action on climate change. The flood affected 33 million people, displaced 8 million people, took 1,700 lives, and accounted for roughly US $31.5 billion in economic losses. Such events are not isolated incidents, but are becoming increasingly frequent and intense due to the changing climatic conditions. These impacts are far from equal. Vulnerable groups such as indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, women, and persons with disabilities bear the brunt of the consequences, exacerbating existing inequalities. Gender is often not mainstream in climate change policies, hindering access to climate finance for women's groups. Additionally, urban populations, particularly the poor, bear the brunt of urban heat exposure. In the face of these challenges, it is crucial to recognize that communities are on the front lines of climate change. Local actors often possess a wealth of indigenous and traditional knowledge that are best equipped to prioritize critical issues for adaptation. However, they face significant challenges with limited capacity and power to adapt effectively. It is in this context that the principles of locally led adaptation emerges as an alternative approach to resilience building. Developed by the Global Commission on Adaptation, these principles aim to empower local actors and shift the current top-down approach to a new model where communities have the resources and authority to build resilience. The principles of locally led adaptation are beginning to gain momentum in the Asia-Pacific region and are being integrated into policy and planning approaches. For instance, you heard from Professor Salim earlier, countries like Bangladesh, Nepal have explicitly integrated locally led adaptation into policies and planning approaches and empowered local governments in planning and decision making. However, there are also associated challenges in advancing locally led adaptation, such as addressing power imbalances at the local level and ensuring that vulnerable groups are not further marginalized for the benefit of local elites. Also, given the growing popularity of locally led adaptation, there is a risk of diluting the concept and any projects with local engagement being branded as locally led. Therefore, it is vitally important to strike a balance between locally led adaptation and broader systems transformation, as Professor Salim aptly put it earlier, recognizing that both are vital for meaningful adaptation. Next slide, please. In terms of the barriers to community resilience, despite the imperative to build resilience, various barriers impede our progress. These barriers cut across different aspects of resilience enablers, demanding comprehensive and collaborative solutions to address them. One of the key challenges lies within the policy and governance realm. Weak institutional framework and inadequate governance structures can impede locally led adaptation efforts, leaving communities struggling to coordinate with higher level authorities and access critical information. The absence of a coordinated approach between different levels of government further exacerbates the issue, as subnational actors are often excluded from development of top-down adaptation policies. Moreover, the engagement of key stakeholders such as civil society and non-governmental organizations within national climate governance architectures is often ad hoc and patchy, hindering the effectiveness of community resilience building efforts, especially when important voices like those of women are underrepresented in decision making. The definition of local also needs critical assessment to ensure equitable adaptation. Often, local administrative units are dominated by specific groups, excluding diverse perspectives from vulnerable segments of society, making impactful and equitable adaptation results difficult to achieve. In terms of planning and programming, the focus on short-term development priorities undermine the importance of long-term climate action and resilience building. Most adaptation interventions tend to be reactive rather than proactive, missing opportunities for risk prevention and preparedness. National adaptation planning often fails to adopt a location-based framing, limiting its effectiveness in supporting locally led adaptation efforts. Such planning is often at the regional perspective, which is a good start, but has not quite reached the local or community scale yet. A checkbox mentality driven by donor requirements hinders inclusive planning, and an elitist approach restricts accountability to marginalized communities. Moreover, communities often lack the technical expertise and skills necessary to design and implement effective adaptation projects. The lack of capacity of civil servants at the local level, already burdened with multiple responsibilities, poses an additional hurdle in integrating climate change adaptation into their existing roles. In the realm of science and assessment, limited baseline data, climate projections, and impact assessments further compounds the challenges faced by certain subregions, such as small islands and remote mountain communities. This lack of data prevents communities from fully understanding their vulnerability and impacts of climate change on their livelihoods. Even when relevant information is available, it is often not presented in a format easily applicable to local contexts, hindering its effective utilization by end users, including community members and practitioners. The exclusive reliance on Western science can overshadow the value of indigenous and traditional knowledge, which holds invaluable insights into local resilience and effective adaptation solutions. Neglecting this diverse knowledge systems might lead to an incomplete understanding of climate risks and consequently less effective adaptation strategies. Emerging adaptation technologies and practices, while promising, are often out of reach of many communities. Lack of technical knowledge, information, and access to finance for these technologies constitute significant barriers to their uptake. Another significant issue is the weak institutional links and extension services. This lack of connection and support prevents communities from effectively accessing and implementing these technologies. Finally, finance and investment is another significant barrier. Overall, funding for adaptation is inadequate globally, as you all know. Vulnerable populations often receive only a fraction of available finance, while the lack of financial devolution to local levels can hinder community-driven adaptation. Strict fiduciary standards and management rules may further impede communities' access to funding and financial capacity building support. It is therefore important to note that it is important to note also that these barriers is not exclusive and does not include, for instance, psychological, social cohesion, individual perception, education, cultural aspects, which are also important aspects in adaptation. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so among the many opportunities that exist, the outlook proposes 4 key opportunities for transformative action to enhance community resilience. The first opportunity lies in fostering local innovation and entrepreneurship for locally led adaptation. By developing and sharing new technologies and business models, communities can enhance their resilience and capacity to adapt. Climate resilient agriculture practices, efficient water management systems, renewable energy solutions, early warning systems, and climate information tools empower communities to address climate challenges effectively. Encouraging entrepreneurship in adaptation stimulates economic growth and job creation, as entrepreneurs directly market opportunities and develop innovative products and services to meet adaptation needs, leading to economic benefits and increased resilience. The second opportunity involves valuing indigenous and traditional knowledge, innovation, and practices. Indigenous peoples and local communities possess a wealth of traditional knowledge and a strong understanding of local climate change issues and possible solutions. These tried and tested solutions built on detailed knowledge of local ecological conditions have often been overlooked and undervalued in adaptation planning. Embracing non-conventional approaches like oral storytelling and visual media can help share local climate change adaptation strategies and preserve community traditions. Furthermore, combining indigenous and traditional knowledge with Western science through co-production can yield effective results in disaster risk reduction and management. The third opportunity centers on promoting locally led, community-based, nature-based solutions. Active participation and empowerment of local communities to identify vulnerabilities, needs, and priorities lead to more inclusive and contextually appropriate resilience strategies. Strengthening community networks, fostering social cohesion, and promoting local leadership enhance resilience at the grassroots level. Nature-based solutions such as protecting and restoring ecosystems like mangroves, forests, and wetlands offer multiple benefits, including flood control, water purification, and climate regulation. Brought together, community-based, nature-based solutions can strengthen local ecosystems, which in turn can provide benefits for community resilience. Lastly, there's also an opportunity to lengthen and enhance the flexibility of adaptation financing, recognizing that adaptation is a continuous learning process. Prioritizing patient capital can allow for more flexible programming and learning while maintaining transparency and accountability. Shifting focus to monitoring and reporting on long-term resilience building rather than stringent proposal requirements can better support vulnerable communities. Community-focused funding initiatives like the UNDP Small Grants Program have shown commendable success in supporting local projects that conserve biodiversity, sustainable land management, and adapt to and mitigate climate change. In conclusion, the Asia-Pacific region stands at a very critical juncture in its fight against climate change. So building resilient communities is essential to safeguarding lives and livelihoods from growing threats posed by extreme weather events. By addressing the barriers and embracing the opportunities before us, we can pave the way for transformative actions in community resilience. So this is my last slide, and I would like to leave you with these 4 key questions and encourage you to please post your responses, thoughts on this question in the chat. Number 1, how can we address systemic barriers that hinder implementation of transformative community resilience? Question 2, what are the regional priorities for strengthening community resilience efforts? Number 3, are there examples of innovative community resilience solutions at regional, national, or subnational levels? Number 4, what are the areas for regional cooperation to address transboundary dimensions of community resilience? So thank you very much for your attention and for this opportunity to present the outlook. We look forward to your inputs. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Karma. And again, I want to reiterate the last point. If you have any additional information or inputs reflecting what we have shared so far from the draft outlook, please reach out to us. The contact information is on screen. We'll hopefully be able to share the slides with you afterwards. The email could come to me directly and my colleague Jay Mollett. So with that, thank you. And I just want to touch lastly again to really emphasize the 4 questions that we want your participation in this webinar, which are: how can we address systemic barriers that hinder implementation of transformative community resilience? What are the regional priorities for strengthening community resilience effort? example of innovative community resilience solutions at regional, national, or subnational levels. It can be financial, social, institutional, or technological. And last but not least, areas for regional cooperation to address transboundary dimensions of community resilience. Please share that. Any thoughts on that in the Q&A section or into the chat if you can, and we'll try to respond or call on you during the Q&A session for your thoughts on those. And next up for our session will be the panel discussion. Can we go a couple more slides? No, sorry, go back a little bit. Please allow me to make a quick intro to the panel member. There's Mr. An Sahau. He's the senior teacher at Maka Primary School. And apologies. He holds the position of senior teacher at Maka Community High School and has 23 years of experience. Additionally, he is the founder of the Moanga Viability Institute, which is actively engaged in conducting development training programs aimed at empowering rural communities. He graduated from the Solomon Islands National University in 1997, specializing in primary teaching. Later on, he pursued additional studies at the University of the South Pacific, obtaining a diploma in educational leadership and change, followed by a graduate certificate in school leadership. We also have Ms. Saliha Dobarsik. Apologies if I bungled that pronunciation, are a senior climate change specialist with the Adaptation Fund, where she coordinates programming and innovation, including over $500 million in funding requests annually, and leading the development of the fund's innovation program since joining the fund in 2018. Prior to this role, she was a senior climate change specialist with the Global Environmental Facility Climate Change Adaptation Program, namely the Least Development Countries Fund and Special Climate Change Fund, working on various strategic, technical, and policy aspects of the 1.4 billion program portfolio. And Ms. T. Ms. T. Duyen, apologies again for the mispronunciation, is an accomplished aquaculture engineer with 27 years of experience who has been actively engaged with Baglues Farmer Association, contributing to projects focused on enhancing production models, particularly in fisheries and rice shrimp cultivation. Her work includes promoting the active involvement of women and the community in climate change adaptation initiatives. She has actively participated in various forums and panels on community-based adaptation organized by UNDP, showcasing her expertise and commitment to a sustainable development practice. And next up will be a quick presentation of the work. Misty.
Dạ, xin chào các anh chị. Bạc Liêu là khu vực địa lý ưu tiên ở các tỉnh miền Trung và miền Đông Nam Bộ. Trong đó thì cũng 14 tỉnh mà đồng bằng sông Cửu Long, thì trong đó Bạc Liêu cũng là một trong 4 khu vực đặc biệt ưu tiên trong cái 12 dự án đồng bằng sông Cửu Long, là đa dạng cái vùng sinh thái. Đặc biệt ở Bạc Liêu có 3 dạng vùng sinh thái, là sinh thái nước ngọt, sinh thái nước lợ và sinh thái nước mặn, là vùng chuyển đổi. Được UNDP cũng hỗ trợ đầu tư một cái dự án thực hiện trong cái biến đổi khí hậu vào giai đoạn 14 và 2017, và trước đó thì cũng có một dự án là giai đoạn 2009-2012. Thì đối với ở Bạc Liêu thì cũng là một trong những khu vực mà nằm trong cái điều kiện chung của 12 tỉnh đồng bằng sông Cửu Long, chiếm 25% diện tích. Đồng bằng sông Cửu Long cũng là một trung tâm nông nghiệp lớn nhất của cả nước, chiếm 50% sản lượng lúa, với 65% sản lượng nuôi trồng thủy sản và khoảng 70% sản lượng trái cây. Trong đó 95% sản lượng gạo xuất khẩu và có 60% sản lượng cá xuất khẩu của Việt Nam. 120.000 hectare của vùng với 12% diện tích tự nhiên của Việt Nam chịu tác động rất là nghiêm trọng của hạn hán và xâm nhập mặn. Thì đồng bằng sông Cửu Long là một cái vùng sản xuất nông nghiệp thủy sản lớn nhất của Việt Nam với diện tích canh tác là hơn 2,4 triệu hectare trên tổng 4 triệu hectare đất tự nhiên. Và hiện nay với sự biến đổi khí hậu và nước biển dân thì cùng với các cái thử thách xuyên biên giới như sự phát triển của các đập thủy điện, thì dự án chuyển nước của thượng nguồn sông Mekong cũng tạo ra rất nhiều thử thách và khó khăn mới cho các kiểu canh tác nông nghiệp cổ truyền và đe dọa đến sự phát triển bền vững của vùng. Do quá trình khai thác mà sản xuất qua nhiều và tăng liên tục của nhiều vụ, và nguồn dinh dưỡng của đất cũng bị suy kiệt dần. Do tác động tiêu cực của biến đổi khí hậu và nước biển dân thì vấn đề này cũng đã làm ảnh hưởng đến hệ sinh thái trong vùng sinh thái. Đó là đặc biệt là ảnh hưởng lớn nhất là vùng sinh thái nước lợ, và xuất phát từ cái sự sáng tạo của nông dân cho phù hợp với biến đổi khí hậu, thời tiết, nguồn nước và các yếu tố khác. Thì trong thời gian qua, Hội Nông dân tỉnh cũng đã đề xuất tổ chức phi chính phủ hỗ trợ dự án nhằm có những giải pháp đối phó thích nghi lâu dài hơn. Đây là dự án ở tại Bạc Liêu, trên slide, ở tại slide số 12 cũng có thể hiện. Dạ, xin chuyển slide tiếp ạ. Dạ, xin chuyển slide tiếp anh. Dạ. Về cái sản xuất lúa tôm ở tỉnh Bạc Liêu, việc canh tác lúa tôm ở đồng bằng sông Mekong là trung tâm nông nghiệp, thì với 25% diện tích ở Bạc Liêu, và Bạc Liêu cũng là một trong 12 tỉnh đồng bằng sông Cửu Long thì do tác động tiêu cực của biến đổi khí hậu và nước biển dân thì cũng là chịu ảnh hưởng chung cả vùng. Dạ, em xin chuyển slide tiếp. Chuyển tiếp slide anh ạ. Yeah. Về sản xuất lúa tôm tại tỉnh thì việc canh tác lúa tôm tại tỉnh Bạc Liêu phải đối mặt với nhiều rủi ro và tác động do biến đổi khí hậu đe dọa đến nuôi trồng thủy sản, đặc biệt là canh tác nông nghiệp tại vùng trũng khi hiện tượng xâm nhập mặn ngày càng nghiêm trọng xảy ra. Và theo kịch bản của biến đổi khí hậu thì vùng đồng bằng sông Cửu Long nhiệt độ trung bình hàng năm có khả năng tăng rất nhiều, dao động vào năm 2050 và làm mực nước biển dân tăng thêm 330 ml. Thực tế thì đầu năm 2020 thì độ mặn cũng dao động từ 5 đến 75 phần ngàn và đã xâm nhập sâu vào nội đồng, làm ảnh hưởng đến hàng nghìn hecta lúa của nông dân bị mất trắng. Và bên cạnh những hiện tượng trên thì vùng hạn hán nghiêm trọng nhất là vào mùa khô và vào mùa mưa cũng xuất hiện nhiều đợt khô, cũng thỉnh thoảng cũng kéo dài, và như vậy thì cũng làm giảm năng suất lúa. Dạ, em xin chuyển slide. Dạ, em xin chuyển slide. Và những cái kết quả tác động, ví dụ giống lúa một bụi đỏ thì có khả năng chịu mặn thì được thuần hóa với kỹ thuật dựa vào cộng đồng. Đây là dự án rất là thích nghi với môi trường kỹ thuật với cái giải pháp canh tác mô hình lúa tôm nó hỗ trợ qua lại lẫn nhau, là một điều kiện rất là cần thiết đối với vùng sản xuất ở địa phương. Vì khi mà trồng lúa thì là cái gốc rạ của lúa sau mà vụ thu hoạch sẽ bị quay mục đi, đó là làm thức ăn cho tôm, và đồng thời cũng là tạo ra chất hữu cơ để cung cấp thêm cho đất. Và song song đó thì ghép cái mô hình tôm trong lúa thì tôm là chất thải của tôm cũng là nguồn cung cấp dinh dưỡng rất là tốt cho cây lúa để phát triển. Từ cái mô hình phối hợp đó thì đã làm giảm chi phí sản xuất và tăng thu nhập từ 15 đến 20%, và năng suất tôm cũng tăng khoảng 130 đến 160 kg trên hectare năm, và lúa cũng tăng từ 3,2 đến 3,5 kg tấn trên hectare năm, lãi một năm từ 20 đến 30 triệu đồng. Với sản xuất tôm vậy được coi là biện pháp thích ứng tốt nhất trong hệ sinh thái nước mặn lợ và mang lại cái hiệu quả rất cao bền vững đã góp phần ổn định sinh thái trong tỉnh, trong vùng, cũng như là góp phần ổn định sinh thái của khu vực đồng bằng sông Cửu Long. Mô hình cũng đã được thực hiện và lồng ghép vào kế hoạch thích ứng của địa phương với biến đổi khí hậu. Chính quyền địa phương cũng đã ưu tiên phát triển mô hình lúa tôm cho 5 huyện còn lại, và sau khi dự án kết thúc thì dự án cũng được nhân rộng lên trên 30.000 hectare theo kế hoạch của chính quyền địa phương. Và trong việc dự án đã ổn định được hệ sinh thái, kết quả của dự án cũng được nông dân đồng tình rất cao. Ứng dụng tiếp tục giới thiệu cho nông dân trong vùng mở rộng diện tích, và hiện nay cũng đã dần dần lan tỏa, dự kiến đến năm 2030 mở rộng đến 50.000 hectare. Và từ giải pháp kỹ thuật trên đã phát huy được năng lực của cộng đồng, tạo nền tảng cơ bản để xây dựng vùng nguyên liệu tập trung, từng bước thực hiện chuỗi liên kết đầu vào đầu ra của sản phẩm trong vùng dự án và mở rộng liên kết giữa các tỉnh lân cận. Xin chuyển slide. Qua cái mô hình tôm lúa, sau khi được nhân rộng cũng thúc đẩy sự tham gia của cá nhân và các doanh nghiệp, cơ hội đầu tư để thực hiện mở rộng thêm mô hình nhằm giúp cho nông dân hưởng lợi từ chương trình dự án. Và đặc biệt là trong cái hoạt động dự án thì có sự tham gia của nữ và người dân tộc Khmer, trong đó chiếm trên 30% là nữ lao động thời vụ, và dân tộc Khmer là trên 15% ở trong cái vùng địa phương thực hiện dự án. Thì nhằm nâng cao cái năng lực của nữ lao động trong thời vụ sản xuất nông nghiệp, và trong mô hình dự án giúp cho nông dân nữ được nâng cao năng lực trong việc quản lý vận hành tổ nhóm của bình đẳng giới, rồi an sinh xã hội, rồi tham gia đề xuất các chính sách tham vấn, đối thoại cộng đồng giữa các nhóm đối tượng mục tiêu với chính quyền địa phương và các cơ quan có liên quan, giúp cho nữ nông dân cũng tiếp cận được nhiều thông tin, kỹ thuật, việc làm, góp phần ổn định sinh kế và nâng cao được vai trò của phụ nữ trong bình đẳng giới, hợp tác được củng cố và phát triển. Thì cái ý nghĩa của dự án đối với góp phần giải pháp các giải pháp kỹ thuật cũng áp dụng trong canh tác lúa tôm để hạn chế phân bón hóa học trên đồng ruộng, cũng chứng minh là những sáng kiến thích ứng thân thiện với môi trường, tác động tích cực với môi trường nhằm tạo điều kiện cho môi trường ổn định hơn, và các sản phẩm tạo ra được xanh, sạch, làm nền tảng cho sự phát triển nông nghiệp bền vững trong điều kiện hiện nay để duy trì lâu dài. Cái hoạt động của dự án cũng tác động tới kinh tế, là tiến bộ kỹ thuật cũng được ứng dụng trong mô hình trình diễn, mang lại sản phẩm lúa tôm có giá trị cả chất lượng và năng suất. Và tác động về xã hội với trên 2.500 nông dân cũng được tập huấn kỹ thuật, tập huấn hội thảo, rồi xây dựng các cái hoạt động tổ hợp tác, cũng như các cái hoạt động nâng cao về nhận thức khác thì cũng được nông dân tích cực tham gia, và tăng cường phát triển kinh tế tập thể trong vùng, bao gồm nâng cao năng lực cho các tổ hợp tác để nâng cao giá trị sản xuất, rồi khuyến khích phụ nữ để khởi nghiệp trong ứng dụng khoa học công nghệ. Em xin các cái biện pháp thích ứng hiệu quả là áp dụng cái phương pháp tiếp cận dựa vào cộng đồng nhằm ưu tiên các dự án thí điểm có khả năng mở rộng và nhân rộng, kết hợp kiến thức truyền thống của công nghệ trong việc thiết kế và áp dụng các biện pháp thích ứng, định hướng cây trồng chủ lực theo nhu cầu của tỉnh để phát triển các sản phẩm hàng hóa đặc thù đặc trưng của địa phương, từ đó mà nhằm đảm bảo sinh kế bền vững và phát triển kinh tế của địa phương, giải quyết các tác động ngắn hạn và dài hạn của biến đổi khí hậu đối với sinh kế và hệ sinh thái, đồng thời thử nghiệm các biện pháp thích ứng ngắn hạn và dài hạn. Song song đó còn giải quyết thêm các vấn đề liên quan đến biến đổi khí hậu, đặc biệt là xác định vấn đề trọng tâm ưu tiên trong chiến lược và kế hoạch hành động ứng phó biến đổi khí hậu của quốc gia và địa phương, bao gồm hạn hán, lũ lụt, xâm nhập mặn và thiên tai, cũng phù hợp với nghị quyết 20 của tỉnh, và trong cái phát triển tăng trưởng xanh của tỉnh Bạc Liêu, thực hiện chương trình phát triển của Liên Hiệp Quốc về xanh hóa chuỗi tôm, thì hiện nay thì Bạc Liêu cũng thực hiện được các cái chương trình và đang mở rộng diện tích, duy trì phát triển trong hệ thống của hội nông dân, hội phụ nữ và đoàn thanh niên trong các cái hội đoàn thể của tỉnh. Xin kết thúc ạ. Xin cảm ơn tất cả các anh chị. Thank you. Good, healthy and happy days.
Thank you, Ms. T.
Yeah.
I want to highlight again that it's really inspiring to see, you know, the on the ground, you know, knowledge sharing and experiences of what Professor Salim Haq was describing in terms of really adaptation is about people to people, the cooperation, the knowledge sharing that is not only happening in your community, but growing it and really expanding the knowledge sharing and also experience it and widening the impact of the upside and also the sustainable climate resilience action that's being taken. And I do want to highlight ask one quick follow-up question to that. For specifically around, you mentioned the traditional knowledge and technologies. Do you want to highlight one traditional knowledge that you saw that really shined through in a lot of the work that you've done? Apologies, Ms. T, but you're still on mute, so I can't hear you.
Dạ. Alo. Dạ.
Yeah.
Nghe anh nghe chưa ạ? Dạ. Alo. Dạ. Thì với kiến thức bản địa thì nông dân ghép nuôi tôm trồng lúa để giảm chi phí là do sau cái vụ trong cái sản xuất đó, thì từ sên ruộng và trong cái quá trình thực hiện đó thì cái mô hình này đã hỗ trợ tương tác lẫn nhau. Khi mà thu hoạch lúa thì để lại gốc rạ, và gốc rạ được một phần nó bị ủ hoai trong cái môi trường nước, còn khi gặt lúa mà còn ẩm á, thì để làm thức ăn, khi nó mục rã thì là phiêu sinh vật để làm thức ăn lại cho tôm, và đồng thời á, cái phần mục rã đó cũng là một phần tạo cái chất hữu cơ lại cho nền đất của đáy ao. Và cái phân tôm mà khi chất thải tôm mà trong cái môi trường tôm lúa đó, thì khi mà chất thải tôm nó thải ra thì vừa một phần tạo cung cấp thêm một nguồn phân dinh dưỡng cho đất và làm màu mỡ thêm đất, và cái chất thải tôm đó thì cũng là tạo được cái phân hữu cơ rất là ổn định cho cái môi trường nuôi. Thì nông dân cũng không, trong quá trình thực hiện không có sử dụng mà cái chi phí để mua phân, và cũng không có sử dụng là chi phí để mua thức ăn cho tôm, tại vì cái mô hình tôm lúa là có sự hỗ trợ tương tác. con tôm ôm cây lúa. Chính vậy mà làm giảm chi phí rất nhiều và ổn định được hệ sinh thái của môi trường nước, tạo được vừa tạo thức ăn phiêu sinh thực vật tự nhiên mà cũng vừa tạo là phân hữu cơ tự nhiên cho cung cấp lại cho cái nền đất đá ao, thì mô hình được duy trì nó ổn định và bền vững. Dạ. Dạ em xin hết ạ. Alo.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So next up is Ms. Saliha Dobarsik. So I want to. So the question I want to pose to Ms. Saliha is essentially, given that the adaptation was really the early adopter of the principle for locally led adaptation, what challenges and lessons learned that you can share in seeing the implementation of these principles in practice in the region so far?
Thank you very much for inviting us, first of all, to participate in this event that has so far been very interesting. And the question that you've posed to me, in fact, has been answered in bits and pieces throughout the different interventions. And so I will just quickly, I think, reiterate some of the ideas that we may have already heard. So it is true what you said, that the Adaptation Fund has been an early adopter of locally led adaptation principles, the LLA. And the reason for this is because the work of the Adaptation Fund has been for a long time now aligned with what was then defined as the LLA. And the reason for that is, I believe, I mean, there are many reasons, but what's embedded in our core mandate is the so-called direct access and the principle that the funding should go to the vulnerable communities, that the adaptation is local, that impacts of climate change are local, therefore adaptation needs to happen locally. And direct access is this idea that the funding should go in the most direct way to those who need it. And in practical terms, what this has meant, given that we are a UNFCCC, or actually founded by the Kyoto Protocol, created by the Kyoto Protocol, that means we serve the parties, of course, and we pioneered this idea that the funding would go directly to the countries. So that's how it started. But then over time, and again, before the LLA principles were established or announced, I would say, we have seen that some of these national implementing entities, these national organizations that are accredited to the fund that were receiving funding directly, were then further devolving finance more locally. So we had examples of projects, for example, in South Africa and Costa Rica, before we actually had a specific funding window or modality for that kind of thing. So the demand for that, for the locally led adaptation-based projects came up organically, and you could say it was, with respect to the Adaptation Fund, a bottom-up event, or a few events. And so we decided to establish, well, our board decided to establish a specialized window. It's called Enhanced Direct Access, which is governed by policies that are tailor-made to support locally led adaptation. In other words, we have modified criteria and processes, not so much the processes, but the rules for accessing the funding and what's allowed under the so-called enhanced direct access window, which allows for finance to be further devolved. So what we are seeing from this experience, or actually before I say that, and because there seems to be a lot of interest, and of course we understand that there is a need for more funding for locally led adaptation. More recently, the window that I mentioned, the enhanced direct access, has been operational for would say a couple of years now, but more recently this spring, our board essentially signed off on an implementation plan of a 5-year-long we call medium-term strategy that will guide the work of the fund between yes, now and 5 years from now. So this is essentially in this document, essentially there is a plan to establish additional funding windows that support locally led adaptation. That will complement the one that's existing and make it a more comprehensive package, for example, to serve countries that may not yet have direct access provider or a national implementing entity, as we call them. So, what we're seeing so far with this experience in trying to support locally led adaptation are some of the issues that have been mentioned already. We are seeing that the main obstacles tend to be with concerning the understanding of what locally led adaptation means in the context of a funder like the Adaptation Fund. So essentially, what we do through our readiness program is offer a lot of capacity building so that the implementing entities that may wish to access funding for locally led adaptation, first of all, understand our processes and procedures, which we try to keep simple, but also to understand how to structure the projects, what is and isn't allowed, and you know, what are some of the best practices. So there's a lot of, I would say, learning and sharing, which is one of our pillars that occurs, and we've, for example, issued a report on the experiences from the Adaptation Fund portfolio concerning locally led adaptation, and I warmly welcome you to check that out. It's a few years old now. The other thing we're seeing is that there needs to be, when, for example, when this funding is offered for locally led adaptation, there needs to be a bit more flexibility, because at the time of project design, not all recipients or all the communities at the local level will have been identified. So whereas we thought of these organizations as the executing entities, they're actually not known necessarily very often ahead of time. So this is something that we're seeing, an area where we will try to make some improvements to make it more readily accessible. for the intended recipients. What we're also seeing is that it's really important for the projects to still be consistent with the national and regional programs and frameworks. So even if we do not know what the individual interventions will be, they should be in alignment with at different scales. So this is something that needs to be considered. And I think I just want to reiterate the points of involvement of local communities in the design of these interventions, which kind of goes without saying. And among the adaptation funds criteria when looking at a proposal, of course, there has to be evidence of consultations, and this is just as important in any other project, but I think it has very specific implications for a locally led adaptation kind of a project. And so the point that Salim made about the importance of the local element at all stages, including even down to monitoring and evaluation, is one that I think we also find is very much true and relevant. I think that maybe I will stop for now and turn it over and maybe come back if there are additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. And thank you once again for staying up so late to join us. And I just want to say additionally that it's really good to hear about the fund's exploration to expand the flexibility consideration, and really to see how to also advise on really staying consistent with the national and regional framework for funding requests moving forward and so on. But I do want to have one quick take, that since it's kind of alluding to your initial point on this alignment. It's looking at it from a little bit of this systems thinking, a little bit systems transformation. If not all are perfectly aligned, have you seen how that has been kind of steered or navigated in from your view? If not, it's okay. Just a quick question on that.
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. I think I think we're still learning from the interventions that are de facto enhanced direct access ones, because what we've had so far were, I would say, locally driven enhanced direct access interventions. So the criteria that we used were not at that time tailor-made for that kind of thing, and the approach was quite structured, but maybe not structured in a tailored way to support locally led adaptation per se. So it's a little bit difficult for me to say in absence. I think we'll be in a much better position to see how this plays out. Again, like I said, it's one of the criteria is country drivenness and alignment with plans and policies and frameworks that adaptation and other relevant sectors, by the way. So, and NAPs and NDCs. And I think in combination with that alignment, and given that it is true that local communities sometimes know, often know their, I don't want to call it science because it's not necessarily scientific in the classical sense, but they have the information that has maybe not been published yet, that is maybe not been made available through the conventional ways of, that we would look for information. They have it right there, and they also have the experience and traditional knowledge, and so there is that bottom up, and then there is the the parameters of our criteria, or the adaptation funds criteria, which hopefully are cohesive and coherent. Yeah, maybe I'll stop at that.
No, thank you. And apologies for kind of putting you on the spot for that. No, but I really look forward to seeing the progress and really the investment being made at the local level, and really seeing how that spans out a little bit more in the years and years ahead. So really it's not my intention, wasn't my intention to really put you on the spot like that. It was just a kind of a pondering of something I was thinking of, reflecting from what you've intervened. But so without further ado, I want to now go over to Mr. Ansa Ho for his for his questions. Basically, I want to ask him quickly, given the recent history, Solomon Islands has experienced increasing frequency in climate impacts events such as storms, cyclones, damaged coral reefs, and so on. Do you see what have your community done in response to these changes? And do you want to have any highlights in terms of traditional indigenous knowledge that has been utilized in really taking steps forward in addressing the changing climate? Over to you, Mr. Ansa.
Thank you very much. I hope you're getting me clear there. It's a privilege and an opportunity to be invited to this APAN Climate Change Leader Forum. And I will be telling you something about environmental changes around our communities here in Solomon Islands, more especially in Maka Primary School, where our communities are on just in the seafront. I think first of all, I'd like to say something about the changes and impacts that are taking place in our islands, and of course in our school. Firstly, I think there is continuous uncertain rainfall patterns that is one of the changes that we have experienced. Even as we speak now, we are experiencing continuous uncertain rainfall patterns, and this is not normal here in Solomon Islands. And this has caused a lot of aftermaths, such as landslides and flooding rivers. And of course, it also contributes to hunger to some of the communities, and it's also affecting subsistence farming in rural areas. And as part of locally led adaptation responses from our communities, people used to stay back at home because, as we all know, these changes are new, and we haven't experienced this before, and we are in a learning curve, and we are trying to learn and look kind of response to this uncertain rainfall patterns. And so people normally, they don't go out, they stay back in their homes. And sometimes men would go and collect firewood from flooded rivers or probably in the seafront where there is rough seas, just to get the firewood so that people can stay warm by using firewood at home in their kitchens. And so they also, because of the heavy rainfalls, they also rely on people in the towns like the Honiara city, where we depend much on relatives to send us food such as rice as a staple food for us here in Solomon Islands. So we don't really do a lot of work, and it really affects our livelihood and our daily work programs. Also, as we are experiencing these rainfall patterns and uncertain rainfall patterns, we are also these rainfall patterns are accompanied with strong winds, and these unpredicted strong winds, they sometimes last for only few hours and then they stop, and this has caused high soils and rough seas, and also in Solomon Islands, a lot of people got lost in the ocean because of drifting, because of these uncertain strong winds that happens, and sometimes those in the oceans are never be found when the search is launched for them. And so, as a way of response to these climate changes and impacts, we just stay in a position where we observe. We're observing this kind of climate changes and strong winds, and people usually repair their blown houses, their sucker palm leaf houses. They have to continuous repair on their houses that are blown off, and so we sometimes have to communicate before we can travel, because we don't know what is going to happen along as we travel in the ocean, or probably even in the food gardens. We're also experiencing high sea rise level. This is one of the things that we have noticed here on our shores, where we are experiencing beaches are diminishing and are moving inland because of these high sea levels, and the waves are pushing the reefs and the corals back to the mainland, and this has also caused unusual high tides, and we even lost artificial islands, and some islands are sinking, and the people are relocated from those artificial islands to the mainland, and this is one of the challenges where at the moment we are responding by relocating some of the communities and houses from where they have been, and of course, the food gardens are also destroyed by flooding rivers and this high sea level rise. I think we are also, one of the things that we have experienced so far here is the increased heat from sunlight. We are experiencing the environment is getting hotter than the usual sun heat that we experienced in the past. And so people would normally go to their food gardens and do their normal livelihood business early in the morning or probably late in the afternoon, so that they can get their work done. And so one of the things that we have experienced is the global warming or the heat from the sun that is increasingly going on here among our communities. And so I think these are some of the environmental changes that we are experiencing here in our community, and of course in Solomon Islands. And these are some of the locally led adaptation activities that we are carrying out in our communities. In terms of teaching the students in the classroom, we are also the school in Solomon Islands, we have a curriculum, and in social studies we are learning about climate change and disaster risk management. So the students are taking some learning on climate change, but it is likely that the topics and those curriculum are already out of date, and there is need to update the curriculum and also to take new ways because of the changes that are happening in the environment here in Solomon Islands. I think these are a few things that I have found, and we have experienced here at Maka Primary School in Solomon Islands. I think before I finish considering the future of our communities, I think our communities, of course, are more vulnerable to different forms of disaster. And as a way of transformative actions, I think there is urgent need to carry out some kind of educational awareness to local communities. And of course, the government needs to be proactive rather than being reactive to climate impacts that we are experiencing here. And so we are assuming that the Ministry of Environment and the government should also step in to help in probably the agricultural alternatives to substitute food shortage and relocations of homes, and probably beside that one, the international organizations can also, in terms of monetary and funding, they should also back up in terms of awareing people on the changes that are happening to climate in our communities, and as well probably fund climate change centers where there should be infrastructures and offices where specialists and equipment and response services should be readily available close to the communities that we are living. So I think with these few remarks, I think these are some of the environmental changes that we're experiencing here at Maka Community School. And I hope I have given some insights on what is happening here in Solomon Islands.
No, thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Asa.
moderator.
No, thank you. No, and we hear you loud and clear on the urgent need for climate resilient action on the ground, and it really really highlights the growing movement and growing support to locally led adaptation. And really, we must also applaud, the shift in direction from financing resources such as Adaptation Fund and other multilateral initiative and funding mechanism that have shifted towards this from the international perspective. And I'm also seeing growing trends at the national level as well across the Asia Pacific region, trying to address this, even though it does not really mitigate all the impacts. It is a very positive sign that we're seeing that things are moving in the right direction. There needs to be more work to be done, and definitely so we want to take I see that we're 3 minutes over time already, so I want to take a few minutes to ask attendants if you would like to have any question you want to ask before I hand it over back to Vanessa to close off the session. I think that's no one has asked any additional questions. So over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Crib. And at this juncture, I would like to call on again Babu to formally close the session. Thank you so much, Babu. Thank you, Crib.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Crib. I know that we are already behind the schedule, so I'm not going to make it very long. First of all, I'd like to thank UNDP for leading the resilience of the community stream. And also, I know that amount of effort gone into for preparing the resilience outlook and also preparing for this webinar. And I know the CRIB is basically the person behind this heavy lifting. So thank you very much, UNDP team, and particularly Crib, you for coordinating everything. I also would like to thank all the speakers and the panel members for sharing their rich experiences, particularly when they talked about their learnings and what is happening at the community level. Fascinating the work and the information. When I was hearing the colleague presenting from Solomon Island talking about the migration is already happening, relocation is already happening, and where in many other countries discussion is basically started that the relocation needs to be done, and where the relocation is already happening. So I see that there are huge scope of learning where the things are already happening and how other communities can get benefit of it. So I think that is the area that we need to explore. What I'm also hearing in terms of not only this webinar, but as this is the third one, from the earlier two webinars, is the system thinking and the alignment. I think this is the word coming very prominently throughout the webinars. So I would like to thank all of you again. But I think one of the things, we know that things are happening, as Crib, you mentioned that the direction is right, but I think the challenge is still remain, what do we need to do to basically expedite the implementation and advance the transformative action in the context of implementing the adaptation interventions. So with that, let me mention it once again that we will have the webinar focusing on the ecosystem and the ecosystem services. It's probably in 20 minutes from now. So I welcome many of you to please join, and we'll be sharing similar the resilience outlook where we stand, but focusing on the ecosystem and the ecosystem services. So with that, let me just also thank all the participants for their participation, not only asking the question, but also responding the questions through the QA channel. So thank you once again, and over to you, Vanessa, if you have any last minute announcement.
Nothing from my end. Thank you, Babu. And I think this is the end for the webinar session. Thank you so much for everybody and for all the participants. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.